very famous for having vulnerabilities several years ago, and everyone started complaining first about the industrial control systems that control really large things like nuclear power plants and aircraft control towers, and pointing out that all these things are designed with no security in mind. And now it's extending to the gigantic whole new industry of consumer appliances, where everything from your car to your refrigerator and your tennis shoes and everything are going to be on the internet. And everybody is just designing that stuff with the same consideration of just making it cheap, low power, small, and nobody even thinks about security. It's also true, by the way, of implantable medical devices like pacemakers and insulin pumps and everything else. All those things are completely insecure too, and people have demonstrated how you can hack them and kill people. As far as I know, there has not yet been a real murder by hacking those things, but the entire generation of devices that people have inside their bodies is largely completely vulnerable. And there's a bunch of hackers called We Are the Cavalry that have focused on that. What happened, see, We Are the Cavalry is Joshua Corman, and he said that he wanted to do something about the problem I was talking about earlier, that the entire security industry is completely misunderstood by the government. And that leads to terrible things, like essentially every cybercrime law Obama tried to pass was all like completely wrong-headed, making everything worse. Even though I think he's generally a good guy trying to improve the world, they just have no idea what they're doing. He wanted to form a lobby. Like the AMA has a very powerful lobby. All the doctors pay dues, and they pay for guys to go to Washington and bribe the politicians to make them pass better laws for doctors. And that's really extremely effective at protecting the industry of doctors. And he wanted to make something like that for security professionals. So he went to Washington and asked the lawmakers, what do you care about? And they said, everything you guys do and everything you talk about makes no sense to us. It's just gibberish. The only thing we can understand is medical security. So that's what he focused on. When they understand that all the devices the doctors are using are hackable and people will die, they get a clue. And that very simple things happen. Like there was a doctor where someone was doing a surgery on a patient, and they had the anesthesiologist there putting in the drugs and monitoring their health. And this is all using computerized equipment based on Windows XP. And so Windows XP decided to put on an update and restart it during surgery. So the anesthesia thing turned off. So the doctor got so angry that all the doctors declared that they would turn off automatic updates on all the Windows XP boxes, which they did. So a year later, they all went down from a virus. And they didn't, eventually they reached the point where you have to turn off automatic update, and then you have to do manual updates sometimes when you're not using them. But it took steps to get there. And that's just the beginning of it. I mean, I wonder how many cars are going to crash because there's a Windows update and the car decides to restart. Or the airplane, or the helicopter, or the aircraft control tower, or the nuclear plant. All these things are really happening to various degrees, not even just getting hacked, but taking stuff that was not designed for this purpose and plugging in just an ordinary operating system in. So that's the joy of embedded operating systems. So we're going to talk about what they are and talk about the kinds that are out there. And in general, the news is very bad, because the point is people that build things expect you to buy one thing and use it for years. And they never have really caught up with this concept of an endless chain of updates from the manufacturer. So most of that stuff never gets patched and remains vulnerable. In practice, the way to protect these things is to protect them from the outside. Because we've all solved this problem already. There are these things called children who are like helpless, and you can't make them stop being helpless in a hurry. So what you do is you protect them from the outside with fences and guards and people, just preventing bad people from getting near them. And you have to do that with these embedded devices that you can't patch. Put some security outside them so that hopefully the attacker can't get in. So an embedded system is anything that's not a general purpose computer. It's a kind of vague definition, and it leads to enormous problems. Like the DMCA was intended to prevent people from hacking into music and making illegal copies of music. And then what happened, of course, as soon as they put encryption on the music, all the hackers immediately cracked it and made cracking tools so they could copy the music anyway. So the DMCA made it illegal to make a hacking tool that will defeat that security. So you're supposed to not try. And that is kind of insane, because often that security is preventing you from fixing defects in the products and such, like the iPhone jailbreak community. So you can get a 3-year exemption from the DMCA for a category of product that makes it legal to defeat the security controls on it for a period of 3 years so you can do research. And that has happened for the iPhone, but it has never happened for the iPad, because no one could figure out how to define what a tablet is in a way that was clear, that could make it possible to go to the store and say, this is a tablet, and this is not a tablet, and this is a tablet. And if you can't make the law clear, for some reason they didn't want to pass it in this case, although it doesn't seem to stop them in any other aspect of security legislation to pass laws that are completely vague. But anyway, They're certainly right that it wouldn't be actionable if you couldn't define it. And so they made a category called phones because they can make phone calls. And things that can't make phone calls are not phones. But exactly what takes a tablet and makes it different than this is very unclear. Anyway. You can make Skype calls, but you can't make phone calls. And that is also because of the law. Because they're very careful to make the phone calls you make here technically different, because if they went through the phone network as phone calls, then all the phone legislation would come in particular, CALEA. If I could make a phone call from my phone, it would be the obligation of the people that made the computer and the software to have a wiretap option, another plug coming out the back that can be somehow connected to make a wiretap now. Whereas if it's Skype, and that's not a phone call, they're off that. And the FBI has tried every year to get some laws passed that they have wiretap order over the internet, and they've never succeeded yet. And if they did, then everyone that has a hotspot in a coffee house would now have to have some backport and some kind of device so that it could be wiretapped. And they'd have to record who's using what IP address all the time somehow. And they'd have to basically, everyone would have to have a credit card and pay for every minute of online time, so there'd be a record somewhere. Yeah?
Just wondering, like SIP boxes, then I guess would...
SIP? Oh, those like the Magic Jack?
Kind of, yeah.
Those are still voice over IP.
SIP goes over POTS lines at some point.
It does. Oh, yes, and SIP servers. Yes, SIP servers do go there, and the POTS lines can be tapped at the phone company. They're provided. There are wiretaps there, but there are not wiretaps legally and required at the internet switching centers. Although, as we know, the AT&T has been handing over the wire backbone to them since about 2010, but that was illegal and retroactively declared non-actionable by an act of Congress. But the CALEA wiretaps are completely legal. They have a special law just for that. The phone companies are required to assist law enforcement by letting them tap phones with a court order. Anyway, so you've got GPSs in your car, you've got automatic teller machines instead of people, these things, and many other items. And all these have small operating systems. And the main point of these operating systems is to be cheap to manufacture, run with a small amount of RAM and a slow processor, and be able to run for a long time with very little maintenance. And that's the point of them, because people expect to just buy a gadget the way they used to buy a mechanical gadget like a lock or a cash register, and they just expect it to work for years. So there are other cases, for example, real-time operating systems. If you press a button on a Windows machine or a Mac, how long it takes before something happens is random, because there are many layers between you and the hardware. There's updates going on in the background and background processes and polling, and sometimes that's not acceptable, like to control a fighter jet or something. So they define real-time operating systems that have a fixed delay between when you press a button and when something happens. By the way, it is an important fact that's been made abundantly clear at the last couple of DEF CONs. When you're in your car and you don't want to hit something and you step on the brakes, you're not stepping on the brakes. You're depressing a switch which sends a signal to a computer that says, please, when you feel like it, get around to turning on the brakes. And if the computer doesn't work, you don't have any brakes, and that's been made abundantly clear. You don't have any steering. So that's we're already there, but we got there without anybody noticing when we got there. From the days when it was a mechanical rod, which could also break, but somehow it seems more reliable than asking a computer, especially a Windows computer, to please turn the brakes on, and don't be doing something else like an update right now or something. Anyway, so you got firewall switches and routers in your buildings, and you're also now controlling your burglar alarm and your heating, ventilation, and air conditioning, and all sorts of other things. And all these things are connected directly to the internet, because that makes them so much more powerful. You could run them without connecting to the internet, and a lot of the manuals for these devices will laughingly say, install them with an air gap for security, but nobody does it that way, because the whole cool thing is you can be far away and connect in and look at your burglar alarm and the camera in your garage and see what the heating settings are at home and everything else. So the way they do that, of course, is by recycling code. Nobody wants to spend the money to write new operating systems for each gadget. They just take either Windows or Linux and strip it down. That is logical as far as it goes. The problem is, most people prefer to use Windows because it's easier to write the code and reuse code, and Windows is very vulnerable because Windows is the all-purpose operating system that has everything you could ever possibly want included, and you'd really have to throw away about 99% of it to get it small enough, and most people don't. So they run a gadget that has a whole bunch of extra functions running that you don't need. So Windows Embedded Standard, they had a whole category of Windows-based devices like voting machines and ATMs and so on. And the standard based on Windows XP, I think, was the first one. And what it has is you can, as you know, you can go into Windows control panel, you can go to add remove programs and add remove Windows components, and you can add and remove components. And all a compact edition of Windows is, it just has more of that available. You can remove large quantities of it. Take away the sound, I don't have a speaker. It's just got more add remove Windows components where you choose what features to include, and you can make a much smaller OS by throwing away all the stuff you don't need. So there's another one based on Windows 7, Windows Embedded Standard. There's an enterprise version based on versions of Windows 7. And you just have a template to help you make it, and here's the deal with industrial automation, the minimum configuration, the thin client, and so on. These things are fun. Another thing people do frequently is they make kiosks. If you go to like Sears, they, instead of having help desks, they have computers on a post, and the computer is open to their web page, and you can browse and see what have you got and where is it. And the idea is that you can't play Pac-Man on it or surf the internet or get it infected with a virus or anything. And there was a 2600 article about 2 years ago that was hilarious about how to hack into them. And they're incredibly hackable. There's really no way to lock down a Windows machine. Microsoft has official recommendations of how to lock down a Windows machine, but there are so many ways to open a command prompt, like F1. And so you can just go to that thing, open a command prompt, install a game, play a game. Those things where you can apply to work here, fill in your details, that stuff's all stored insecurely. You can just go to the command prompt and dump out everybody else's phone numbers and resumes and stuff. It's incredibly easy to do, because when you take a whole giant desktop operating system and then you try to turn off that functionality, it's very hard to really find all that functionality and turn it off. The fact is there's a bunch of keys you can press and motions you can make and icons you can click on that give you access to a help page that'll open a command prompt and so on. For example, Microsoft in Windows Vista, they decided to enforce the product key. So if you don't pay for a product key, you can't use it. So they made it so it would actually, it started with Windows XP with the highly controversial Windows Genuine Advantage update, and then they built it into Vista so that every 30 days, your machine would phone home to Microsoft, and if they didn't like the product key, it would turn it off. Then, of course, Microsoft let that server go down. So thousands of legitimate Vista machines turned off in corporations because their activation server was down, and it said, you must not have a valid copy of Windows. So Microsoft was so humiliated that they took out the product key enforcement in Windows Vista Service Pack 1, and they never put it back. So Windows 10 is now free, Windows 9, 8 is free. Not 9, of course, doesn't exist, but you can install them, and all they'll do is complain. This doesn't appear to be a genuine product. I'm going to turn the background black to punish you, but it doesn't stop working because they never have trusted their own systems to actually have an activation system that they can stay up. So anyway, it goes on that way. The VXWorks is one older, widely used embedded system used for a lot of things. A thing called VXWorks Workbench, which is just similar functions to the other. Now you can choose components of the operating system and build your own custom version of it to put in your gadget. Green Hill made one for the military for a strike fighter, and this is, when you deal with the military, they have a bunch of really onerous security requirements. They say it's, if you want to actually make it up to the Orange Book category A in the trusted criteria, which is the standard, it takes $1 million in 5 years. At least, because what happens is you not only have to have a bunch of code reviews at every step of construction, like consider where you bought the stuff from, consider how we assembled it, consider here, you have to review it, and you have to file paper, a blizzard of paper at every step, proving that you actually did this review and that review. So it turns out this is how you end up with like an $800 hammer for the military, because the company, in order to make military supplies, has to be able to prove that they have many layers of bureaucracy filling out forms and checking things and reviewing things to make sure it's all secure enough. And that's what this Green Hill stuff did. And there's QNX. I visited Cisco a couple years ago, and Cisco was unveiling their latest router. And they said, this is the fastest router in the world. It can take like 1 million terabits per second of traffic or something. Because at the high end, if you're an ISP and you have the traffic for a whole city, there is nobody but Cisco playing up there. Juniper's not there, nobody's there. They just sell to the smaller businesses. And they invented this thing, and I expected a router like this. It was 16 racks full of routers. It was like a whole room, which is what you'd think it would have to be, but it's all tied together in a giant cluster, and it's running this thing, QNX, which they have a special operating system that's completely different than the kinds you'll learn here in CCNA for the smaller routers to handle those giant things. Then there's a RealTime Executive for multiprocessor systems used in spacecraft. So anyway, if you have multiple embedded systems as different gadgets you're using, use different ones, then you have an enhanced attack service. I didn't put it here. There's this. There's a great. I don't know if I mentioned it in this class, but for cultural enrichment, you should go to Twitter and go to Internet of Shit. There you go. This guy exists entirely to point out all the stupid things that are happening. Samsung, of course, is the latest thing. The phones explode. The replacement phones explode. They made washing machines. They also explode. Now they've got like earphones they want you to wear, and people are saying, why should I put this in my ear? And on you go. They've just got more and more and more a Wi-Fi kettle in case you need to boil your water from somewhere else over the internet and burn down your house. That sounds fantastic. And on you go. Just tons and tons of stuff here. And it's just, anyway, I've got to this point where we're talking about using multiple systems. They have a real message here, a real instant message sent over telephone because someone left to go to Europe and their friend is like taking care of their house. And he said, I can't figure out how to turn on the lights or the burglar alarm. And I say, oh yeah, the lights, you have to install an Android app. But for the television, you have to install an iPhone app. So you need to have both. And there's a code for this one is different than a code for this one. And that's the way everybody's house is getting. Because there's no standards and no uniformity, and, I know, even 10 years ago, I knew a guy where next to his couch, he had a basket full of like 20 remote controls. And I said, because he had all his stereo and TV and recording and all that jazz. And that has multiplied more. Anyway, so it's part of this crazy world. And what are the odds that one of those things is vulnerable? I mean, obviously, each one of them has an 80% chance of being vulnerable. So anyway, embedded Linux would be my favorite, of course. Stripping down Linux is probably the most secure thing to do, you would think. And you can certainly cut them down. Now there's monolithic operating systems and another type, we'll get more to them later. But here's a RealTime Linux kernel extension that will take normal Linux and make it RealTime Linux so it controls the time delay between actions and consequences. And then there's OpenWRT and DDWRT. These are special Linuxes intended to put on home routers. If you buy a home router, like you have in your house to provide Wi-Fi and reach the internet and has some firewall capability, the chips put in them are all the same. And the chips have all these advanced features to run VPNs and all kinds of things, bandwidth, throttling, and everything else. And the only thing that prevents you from getting all those features is the software. So you can just take out the software and put in hacked software. There's various brands of it have been out there. DDWRT was one of the earlier ones. More vigorously updated is OpenWRT. I got this one, I just installed it. Let me bring it up. You can run this one in a virtual machine. And so you can replace the firmware in your router with this one. And here it is, OpenWRT. And if you do, all right. So now it's listening. Now I put it on a NAT network, so it's not connected directly to my host, but I can control it from another virtual machine. And that's what this is. So this is the software you could put on your router, and you can run it in a virtual machine. And this one here is another machine opening the Wi-Fi configuration page. So you'll go to 192.168.1.1, and maybe I'm hosed. But anyway, I think I'll just stick with the pictures on this one because the actual screens aren't that great. But you can do this at home. I did this. They tend to crash a little more, but you get all these cool features. This one here, you can go to a page and install tons of software. And I just looked at all the VPNs you can put on. It'll now be a VPN concentrator. You can separate your stuff into VLANs. You can limit the bandwidth separately for different days. You can give your kids only small bandwidth and only certain times of day. There's thousands of packages you can add into your router. And I tried updating these things to run IP version 6. I spent weeks trying to do that with Kirk in like 2007, and it was just awful. Now finally routers support IPv6 more or less out of the box. So here's the two basic types of kernels. The old-fashioned kind, what most people use is a monolithic kernel. Now, in the early days, I had a VIC-20, a Commodore 64, and those things were very simple devices, and one of the crazy things was you were supposed to buy a printer from the same manufacturer as your computer. And if you bought another printer, you might even have to buy a hardware module to plug in between the printer and the computer to translate it. And at the very least, you would have to buy another word processor that can speak to that printer. And this is because there were no layers of structure. So to fix this, we had layered networking, where you have hardware down here, then you have device drivers. So if somebody builds a printer, they write a driver, and you put that driver in, your old software can still talk to the new printer, because this translates whatever signals the word processor typically sends into whatever your electrical signals have to really go to the hardware. The manufacturer of the printer just writes a driver instead of having to write a whole word processor or a whole operating system to go with the printer. So breaking things up into these chunks and layers is much more efficient, so we can have multiple manufacturers selling software and hardware, and it can all work together. But it also means it's putting the user very far from the actual hardware. So when you make a request, it hands over this system and that system and this system and that system, and a chain of command happens sometimes resulting in what you want and sometimes failing because any of those systems can be slow or broken. So if you get tired of that, you can make a microkernel OS, and this is what you do if you really want to make it small. You don't have all these layers, so it's not as versatile. There's a version of Linux like this, Gen 2. See, if you install Ubuntu Linux, like Windows 7 or Windows 10, it has thousands of drivers included. So any possible hardware you might have is already included, which means it has a giant bunch of software that you're not using. It can support 100 motherboards and 1,000 processors, and you're only using one of them. So if you make Gen 2, you have to compile it yourself for your hardware, and it only has the drivers for your hardware, and that makes it much faster, but it's much less versatile, and that's what you have here. Each of your piece of software just goes through a very thin layer right to the hardware, so it's very tied to the hardware. This is the way to make something run faster and be smaller, and probably more secure in general, because it has less total code and less total attack surface, but it also is much less versatile. If you change any hardware, you're going to have to recompile this whole thing and modify it. Whereas with that thing, you can just plug in another piece of hardware, restart it, and it will just turn on some code that was already there that it wasn't using, and you can just go on, which is what we're used to for consumer operating systems. Hey, all right, so I got a few iClicker questions. Come grab one if you need one. I remember in like 1951, they had a Bugs Bunny cartoon of the automatic house where it's supposed to do everything for you and he ends up getting squashed by the ironing board and everything else. But long before computers, we had this vision of the automatic house doing everything for you and creating mad chaos driving us all nuts. Charlie Chaplin had his version out in like 1929. Anyway, it's been around forever. The excessive automation, where you make things too convenient and now nothing works, which is definitely where we are now. So,
except it's not killing us yet.
Well, it might be. And it's job security for us, though. If they build all that crap, they're going to have to hire us to secure it. So that's the good side in all this. There's a bright side to everything. All right, so which one of these runs an embedded OS? So it's a rich field if you want to find vulnerabilities and make a name for yourself and give a talk how to hack your watch and your toaster and your shoes and everything. I'll quit at 30. All right, and the embedded OS there is the self-checkout machine.
Don't they just run Windows?
Well, they might, but they don't give you the keyboard and the desktop and the mouse and everything. They're limited. So that's all any of them are, is a computer with some kind of limited interface and hopefully most of the features turned off. So an iPad is an interesting issue, but you normally think of that as a general purpose computing device. And that's like I was saying, they were unable to find any way to explain what made an iPad different than a computer. When you get right down to it, it's mighty hard. You can open a browser, you can attach a keyboard, you can attach speakers. So exactly where's the special thing that it's lacking that a computer has? But the self-checkout machine clearly lacks all that stuff.
Well, isn't that just kiosk mode? Like, I think of embedded operating system when it's firmware embedded.
And that should be what's in those things. I don't think they have hard disks or anything. I think it's just running.
I'm pretty sure they're just computers in kiosk mode.
They could be, yeah. But they could all, you don't know, you're right. But I know when they first came out, I saw them on a Safeway, it actually said, don't press the refund button, or don't press the button until after you put your money in. And so if you press your button sooner, someone found out it was in 2600, it refunds your money and gives you the product. That was bloody awesome. But anyway, I assume they fixed that. The voting machines are similar though. And they never fixed those. Yeah, voting machines run Windows. They're totally hackable. They found a group from Southern California. I met the guy that did the security review of voting machines. They locked them up, and they locked them up with a key that is the same key for paper towel dispensers. So you can get it everywhere. And then you open that, and there's a USB port, and you can just plug in the USB port and replace all the votes. It's bloody awesome. I mean, they built them at the same security as like video games, basically. And anyway, that's the way it is. Paper is the right medium for voting. That was his message. Anyway, all right, which one is specifically for routers? Paper has this magic feature that you can count it again to verify the count. And if you start by putting it in a computer, you have no way to go back and get the original data anymore. I'll quit at 30. All right, that's OpenWRT, which is the most popular one these days. And some routers are now using OpenWRT for their official routing firmware, which is pretty cool. Anyway, all right. So which one is the Microsoft product that actually published some of their source code? I went by in the slides, so I don't think I remembered to mention it. I'll quit at 30. All right, and that was Windows CE, the earlier one. See, some people have, open source enthusiasts have actually tried to sue and stop governments from purchasing Windows on the grounds that it is illegal for them to use something they cannot audit, where you can't see the source code. And Microsoft has released the source code a few times. Also, their source code has been stolen and leaked. The entire source code for Windows 2000 was stolen and leaked, like WikiLeaks, so people could see, and it's, by the way, all full of them swearing, horrible abuse of others. They'll say, if using the next department at Microsoft for writing crappy software, so I have to write 2,000 lines to make up for it. And, but they've also voluntarily handed over parts of the source code for auditing so they can make sales. And they've occasionally released source code to try to explain to us how they made such appalling security blunders, like in Vista, to try to comfort their customers, saying, look, you couldn't spot it either. It's hard. Anyway, so which one is specifically designed for military requirements? Which is another whole category of security beyond just the code, but the management security, where a bunch of people are filling out papers and engaging in reviews and proving that they are checking for problems. If you take the CISSP or the upcoming CISA course, it'll be a lot of that. There's a ton of work in management of security. Anyway, that's the Green Hill. I think, yeah, it was the Green Hill. All right. Anyway, all right, it's 10 minutes to 7. I guess we ought to take a break till 7. It's the logical time. Let me find the quick time and stop it for the moment. This is 123, chapter 8A.